Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I want to talk about tarot correspondences and why they are brilliant and bullshit at the same time. This is partially inspired by some of my recent studies. This is really just an internal dialogue I've been having that I want to externalize and share, so maybe it can serve as some food for thought for anybody out there who is interested in understanding maybe how and why we read the cards in the way that we do. I, for example, will dissect the reasons that I read into certain things in the cards versus others, and will try to change up my approach and see how that affects the results. I like to be experimental and a little bit theoretical in my approach to the cards and understanding why I do certain things. So that being said, some primary inspirations for this and things that I might be drawing from as I'm speaking are this book right here, The Kabbalistic Tarot, a textbook of mystical philosophy by Robert Wang, along with, and a book that I don't currently have right beside me, but it is Tarotology by Enrique Enriquez, and I thought it would be fun to read this book alongside Enrique Enriquez's book after having seen his documentary. I think the way that he speaks about symbolism and correspondences in the cards, and the fact that he sees them as this sort of inane, useless, and nonsensical sort of attribution that we might tie to the cards versus, of course, very old, not old, but very established occult systems that we kind of take for granted as being connected to the tarot. You may know that I am a big fan of the Thoth deck, which is inherently made with occult symbolism and correspondence in mind. Things like the Kabbalah, astrology, numerology, gematria, among many other sacred mystical texts that have been sort of weaved into the mythology that makes up this deck, and how the deck itself is sometimes seen as a sacred text or used in such a way. And I've also been studying, in very recent times, the Marseille along with playing cards, which are two systems that don't incorporate as overtly or consciously occult correspondence or symbolism in any way. So it's interesting to work with card systems that have this in mind, that really play off of the idea of correspondence, versus card decks that really were made without those sorts of things in mind, or at least were used in such a way where those were at some point kind of irrelevant. So the idea of correspondence, I guess I'll speak to why I find it to be brilliant first and foremost. Systems in general, for me, I perceive them as ways that we can interact with and understand our world. A big one in the Thoth Tarot, and one that I tend to draw upon quite a lot, is the Kabbalah, the idea of this set of emanations of the Tree of Life and the Sephiroth, and the way that we would work our way up to or are descended from this sort of incomprehensible spirit or divine light and find ourselves in a physical experience. It's really wonderful to take a system that can offer explanations, or at least offer some, I would say, rich depth to our experience, ways that we can process and understand the world around us. That, for me, is a big part of why I draw upon correspondences, things like astrology and how they can relate to the human experience and describe personalities, can describe events, can make sense of certain things that happen in the world around us. Things like numerology, speaking to the way that we quantify and use empirical data to interact with the world around us and to make sense of things. All of those systems are man-made. They don't exist just objectively without human thought. They were created by someone, just in the same way that all religious texts and all religions are in some way a product of mankind, whether you believe there to be sentient higher powers that are responsible for why mankind has stumbled upon these sort of belief systems or not. In some way, a person had to, at some point, transcribe or write down what they believed to be sacred, or a system that they adhered to, and all of that sort of became, I would say, a furtherance of the way that we understand the world around us, and somehow that trickled down or was distilled into the idea of tarot and cards. And I think all of that is wonderful because, of course, when we turn, sorry, I'm just trying to grab the deck. when we turn to tarot for something, we're seeking to understand, we're looking for guidance. If we go to a reader, we're hoping that they can offer insight or to hopefully see what would be coming up in our lives based on where we're at, to almost tell our story for us. And I think it's easy to understand story, narrative, the human experience when we incorporate or almost add a lens of looking at it through this more abstract, spiritual, almost predestined sort of way where it's explainable, where it supposedly makes sense because it functions within a certain system that tells us that it makes sense, rather than sort of swimming through a sea of uncertainty without correspondence. So I think correspondence can add a lot of meaning to life. I think it can add a level of safety and security when otherwise there might not be, where we might feel like we're stranded without something or without a reason for what occurs in our lives. And I think a lot of the time we look around us, we like the idea of there being a reason. And I think that's part of the appeal in religion and various myths and cultural practices that exist around the world. I'm not trying to be cynical and say that I don't believe that any of these things actually hold higher value or that they're just human creations. I think I'm of two minds. Part of me believes that they are just simple human creations that are really helpful. And then there's the other part of me that believes that these things exist and were almost part of the structure or working of the universe before humans, and that humans somehow stumbled upon or discovered these sorts of complex ideas through experience over time or through some divine intervention. So I guess I'm of two minds. I can kind of see both camps of those who believe that it's more of just a human creation versus those who see it as something a bit beyond or outside of the human experience. So there's that, and that is why I think symbolism and correspondence in tarot is so brilliant in the way that it works. Of course, the idea that tarot was something that was inherently symbolic and held all of these correspondences, to me, is a little bit far-reaching. We know a bit more about tarot history in that, of course, it isn't as old as we believed it to be. These sorts of mystery teachings don't have much founding in history that we can prove in any sort of way or find evidence of in older texts. So somebody did decide to pick up a pack of cards and imbue it with those correspondences. And regardless of what the correspondences actually relate to, or their power, or their, I would say, grander meaning, regardless of all of that, somebody did pick up the cards and have to alter them in some way to reflect those correspondences, which we see in more modern systems like the Rider-Waite-Smith and the Thoth. And to me, there's something that is a bit whimsical about taking correspondences and then taking a sort of pack of cards and altering them in a way where all of these systems can function seamlessly. But then there are also times, I think, when the systems and the correspondences are a bit too far-reaching, when they try to make sense out of things that are just so inherently oppositional or unrelated that it starts to fall apart or fray at the seams, if you will. Things like, for example, when I was reading this book, which I did actually really enjoy, the Kabbalistic Tarot, a textbook of mystical philosophy, there are times when, if one is to study, for example, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Crowley, all of those sorts of mystery schools and teachings, there are times when what is said actually makes a lot of sense, when there's a lot of beauty in the language and the metaphor and the way that we can tie numbers and names and beliefs all into one thing, how the idea of a tree of life can really explain and give a lot of purpose to our experience. But then there are other times where things are connected that seem just so far-fetched, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this way, to the point of me then losing faith in the system overall because of the, I would say, more wild or baseless claims that it makes, and there not being so much founding in what that speaks to. That being said, moving into, I guess, the bullshit aspect of correspondences, which is something I think I can hold within my head or my experience. I am completely fine with finding them both brilliant and bullshit at the same time. I don't necessarily need to reconcile the two camps, and I think it's fun to flow between both and feel okay with that. So that's where I'm at, and I'd be curious to know what others think. But looking to, for example, I just brought out some older systems of cards where these things were not as conscientiously imbued. We have, of course, the standard playing card deck and the Marseille deck. And yes, of course, there are some claims as to more divinatory correspondences being applied to these in their inception. I would venture to say that correspondence doesn't play as large of a role in both of these systems when compared to, for example, the Thoth or the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot. So after reading Enrique Enriquez's tarotology and watching his documentary, him speaking to the idea of the language of the birds and all of this beauty and sort of dispelling and breaking down and dissolving the idea of correspondence and symbolism, and speaking to the fact that nothing is more valid than anything else, the idea that the meaning we ascribe to a card and all that we read into it is just as crazy or nonsensical as if we were to, for example, connect the words or make anagrams out of the letters. So those are some methods he uses. He likes the idea of playing with words, both verbal and written, and rearranging them, and that's something I can really relate to. I went to school for literature, creative writing and literature, so I am a big fan of the written word, both and the verbal word, language in general. I like the idea of storytelling, and I think using the cards as a means to tell story outside of correspondence is a wonderful way to work with the cards for those who maybe don't like to ascribe or imbue their readings with a heavy amount of correspondence. And if we think about it, reading, tying in astrology and Kabbalah, all of those things are wonderful, but if we get too wrapped up in them, the reading starts to get away from us and we can't really tie it to anything practical in our daily lives. How do we take, for example, Pisces and Mars and the 10th and on Malkuth, and how do we start to look at that in terms of our daily experience if we aren't prepared to maybe make the leap of the physical practicality of what these abstract concepts that our correspondences mean, then we're left sort of out to sea without a paddle. So I would say, benefit of not reading into so much correspondence and symbolism is that the cards automatically become a lot more practical. You don't have to try to distill down and, I would say, reduce whatever these concepts are and look at them in terms of your life. They automatically apply. So looking to the cards, for example, as stories or just as words that can then be read into in the way that feels right, or as a psychological tool, or as something that is valid in the way that you read it, regardless of the reason why you think something is the way that it is. Those would all exist, in my opinion, outside of correspondence and symbolism. And so that area can be a little bit unnerving for some. I know it can be for me as somebody who likes the idea of what the correspondences can speak to, this idea of structure within the cards. When we sort of remove all of that structure, when we remove all of that framework that we're used to, it can feel a little bit jarring. It can almost feel like there's this emptiness to what it is that we're using in the cards or looking at, and so the answers can be harder to discern, and it can also take away the magic and the whimsy that I spoke to that those correspondences do provide, or at least in my opinion that they provide. But at the same time, noting and understanding the fact that they're likely made up by human beings who decided that they wanted to add this sort of spiritual framework or these concepts to a system, to me, I would say legitimizes the idea that they are in some ways bullshit, but that they are also brilliant, created by very brilliant minds out there. And I like the idea that I can decide to read the cards without those sorts of layers, and that I can use it as a tool that is more ambiguous, existing outside of correspondence, and just looking to the images for what they are, and deciding that just in the same way that one of our ancestors might look to a clearing with a few trees in it and decide that the number of trees means something, or that the color of the sky means something, I can look to the cards and almost use my own intuitive system. So I guess the idea of correspondence is a little bit more, it's spiritual while being analytical, versus the lack of correspondence or deciding to read the cards outside of correspondence could be perceived as being more intuitive, but at the same time more practical. This is just my opinion, and of course, like I said before, this is me more so externalizing an internal monologue I've been having. I would be curious to know others' thoughts on tarot correspondences and symbolism and the occult sort of underbelly to the history that has gone into the tarot. This is something that I'm thinking of a lot lately in my recent studies, and I find it really fascinating to both value and try to validate those correspondences while also invalidating them or finding holes in them that sort of expose this, I don't know, this artifice that they are, or expose them to be a little bit more or less weighty than maybe I currently thought them to be, or at least taking them down a notch, kicking them down a peg, so that way they don't feel like they are this thing that is above me and outside of me that I have to aspire to understand, when really they are concepts made up by a human being the same as you or I, who thought very much in the same ways potentially that we might. So that being that, I thought I would just offer my 2 cents with a quick snippet on this. Hopefully it made some sense and was something that maybe got you thinking about correspondences and the way that you work with the cards and the way that you read them and why you read them the way that you do. I'd be curious to know how it is that all of you read the cards and what that looks like. Like and subscribe if you thought this was fun or interesting and want to hang around. I hope you are all well, and until next time, bye.